So good afternoon again, everybody, both. And good afternoon to everybody at home as well. We're delighted that you can join us here. So I have the privilege this afternoon to talk about a woman that we all know very well, whom we all love, McAuley. The woman who, for example, conceived the dream of this house and who turned it into a home. And it continues to be a place of loving welcome, a home for Mercy people and for people associated with them. Catherine's a woman who is seen by the Catholic Church, the Universal Church, as a person who is heroic and holy. So I'd like to take a little time with you just to take a look at what do we understand by heroic and by holy, especially when we're talking about the Catholic Church and her decision to canonize one of our members. You know, what do you understand by heroic holiness when I say it to you? Holiness is to be found, as we're told, in the ordinary round of everyday life. What it means essentially is trying to live what we believe God is asking of us, that is, in other words, doing God's will. It means trying to follow Jesus Christ, what he taught us, as best we can. And you and I know this comes with great joy, but also with a cost to ourselves. No one knew that better than McAuley. Extraordinary happenings like ecstasies or levitations or anything of that kind are never taken into account when the life of the person is being looked at by the church when it comes to canonization. And just for a minute, Pope Francis there very recently in his letter, Exultate e Gaudete, he reminds us that holiness is not for the few. It is for each and every one of us. And McAuley has taught us. She said, since God's power is not limited to one time or place or person, you and I, we, as like the great saints, have the very same means as they had. God can do in us what he did in them. In fact, to come to their level of holiness requires nothing more than simply carrying out our day-to-day actions as perseveringly and as well as we can. And this is what constitutes a saint. Now that's Catherine's own words. The church, and maybe never more so as in our time, has great need of saints, holy people, whose lives are dramatic with a humble and unpretentious heroism. A saint is someone who offers so little resistance to the presence and the power of God in her life or in his life, that God is able, as it were, to pour God's self through that person very freely into the person's heart, fill it with love. And that love of God flows out through the holy person's hands, through the holy person's heart, to all those who have need in the world. The poor, the lonely, the sick, the homeless, the helpless, all who have need of God's love, whatever shape or form that takes. And we include ourselves in that, because we ourselves have great need of mercy. And that's what makes a saint. A saint is a real innovator in the church. In a sense, the life of a saint is theology in practice. One saint, one holy person, is worth 1,000 theological concepts. We'll always need theologians to help us to interpret our experiences of the divine, but we need saints, people who will help us to embrace that mystery. Minds are formed, hearts are moved, not by abstract ideas, but by people. It's not books that tell us what holiness is about. It's holy people. So the saints are real gifts from God, as it were. And they surprise us because their stories remind us of the unpredictability of what can happen when a person allows herself to be transformed by God's grace. And I bet you have experience of that in your life. Also, it's not the church that makes the saint. It's God who makes the saint. The church only ratifies God's handiwork and calls attention to the people of God for their encouragement and veneration to the life of this person. So the task of the Congregation for Causes is to highlight the specific difference, to carve out what fresh and new insight God has produced in the person who says, "Here I am, Lord, I come to do your will." So what insight or charism has Catherine McAuley? And again, I don't have to tell you, but let's say it anyway. Catherine's life shines like a beacon because of her insight into the practical, very feminine, practical expression of the merciful love of God, made tangible to the people of Dublin of her time, and continue today in 44 countries throughout the world, 6,000 sisters of mercy at least, and more than 250,000 of collaborators and associates in the mission of mercy. It's a charism, an insight that continues to have extraordinary significance in the church and in the world of our time, as you know and as you experience in your day-to-day life. When the church looks at the life of a person in order to discern the person's holiness, she looks to the last 10 years of a person's life. So there's hope for us yet. The last 10 years of Catherine's life were spent as a religious sister of mercy. She made her profession on December the 12th, 1831. She died on November the 11th, 1841, about 6 weeks after her 63rd birthday, and just a month short of her 10th year in religious life. So you'd say that was providential, wouldn't you? Why the church focuses on the latter years, the last 10 years of a person's life, is that it's understood they're influenced by what has gone before, how the person has lived her life from the beginning. And we arrive at the sunset years of our life, molded and formed by the choices we have made in the various circumstances that life has offered us. So some of the ways in which Catherine was seen as holy by the theologians who looked at her life in quite detail. And these are some of the things that you'd know already, like her strength of spirit and her dependence on God that kept her faithful to her Catholic faith. And we know that because of family circumstances, she struggled during her adolescent and early adult years. But, and this is where her strength is seen, she took practical steps to inform herself about her religion, to be able to answer the arguments that were put up against her religion at home with the people that she moved with in society. The second thing that they found was her marvellous open to the whisper of divine providence, which drew her humble and obedient step by step along her specific vocation. And every one of us has a personal specific vocation within the greater vocation that we have. Her time in Coolock seems to have been her desert time, as it were, during which her relationship with Jesus Christ deepened and matured and focused on her poor, abandoned, Jesus. It gave expression to a personalized response that really came from her heart to God's loving call, which eventually made her a conduit of God's mercy in the world around her. Catherine's spirituality was focused on the suffering Christ. She would say that the congregation she founded was built on Calvary, there to serve a crucified Redeemer. But her real goal, her goal in life, was to bring to the world around her, wherever she was, a practical expression of the merciful love that flows from the heart of the crucified Christ. Another thing they found about her was the total sacrifice, the total giving of all that she was and all that she had for the sake of the poor, the sick, and the uneducated. And this is seen especially when she became the surprise legatee of the not inconsiderable wealth of William Callahan. And she saw that legacy not as something for herself, but as given to her in trust for the poor. She sank every penny she had into this house, into the project of building up a place, a secure place for poor women of the time, a place where young children could be educated. She sank every penny she had. Now just think about it. She had left nothing for herself as an insurance policy, and there was no social welfare at the time. She gave it all, starting in the late 1820s, building and establishing this House of Mercy, which, Baggot Street was a very fashionable place in Dublin at the time. And it was an extraordinary feat for a single Catholic woman of that time and that place, as you'll have learned from the history that you heard this morning as well. Another thing they picked up about her, these are the theologians who were reading into her life, that she not only had great ideas, she also put many of them into practice. It's one thing to have a great idea. It's quite another thing to see it to its logical conclusion. She had her dreams, she had her vision, but she wasn't a dreamer. Even before there was a question of her inheriting the Callahan fortune, she was walking in the garden one evening with William Callahan, and she told him that when he, that is himself and his wife Catherine, would be gone, her dream was that she could do something to help young women to improve and better themselves. She had been thinking, and she thought through what she would do when the Callahans had died and when she'd have to fend for herself, as she thought. Another point they pick out for us is that her knowledge of Scripture is surprising for an Irish Catholic woman of the time. Because Catherine read daily from the Scriptures for Catherine Callahan, who was a Quaker. And so in God's providence, Catherine McAuley was exposed to the transforming power of God's Word, which she read, meditated upon, absorbed, and translated into action. In her words, in her own words, she says, "The life and teachings of Jesus Christ should be as a book, always open before us, from which we are to learn all that is necessary to know." And she also said, what Jesus said and did was said and done to give us an example which our lives should be spent copying. And John Paul II, in his letter Catechesi Tradendae, you've heard of that, haven't you? In that Catechesi Tradendae number 49, he copied Catherine McAuley when he said, "Everything that Jesus said and does teaches us." So she was a woman before her time, without a doubt. Another point they give us is that her devotional prayer was centered on Christ and God's universal mercy, like the Psalter of Jesus, the 30 Days Prayer. And if you read Catherine McAuley's letters or her retreat instructions, you will find in them no sentimentality. She wasn't sentimental. Her prayer reflects her time and place. The language of her prayer does that. But deeper still, it reveals a soul that recognized the importance of connection with God. She had a very deep conviction of the importance of being connected to God. She would say herself, how can we teach the love of God if our own hearts are cold? You can't give what you haven't got. She described prayer as a plant, the seed of which is sown in every Christian. Its growth depends on the care we take to nourish it. And if it's neglected, it will die. If nourished by constant practice, it will blossom and produce fruit in abundance. There's no sentimentality in that, but there's something very profound and someone who is very in touch with nature. And also, Catherine would remind the people who would share her life and charism to try to develop a contemplative and awareness attitude to life, because she knew that it was out of contemplative heart would flow true compassionate service for those in need. She also knew that the fruits of our prayer are never seen in prayer. They're seen in our day-to-day life. And another thing they pointed out was that Catherine had great attention to detail. On her deathbed, you remember this story, she asked that refreshments be prepared in the community room rather than in the dining room, because the sisters coming to the funeral would need a place that was relaxed and comfortable in order to share their grief and to support one another. We call it the comfortable cup of tea, right? We remember her as that. But again, what came through about her was, even when she was drawing her last breath, she was thinking of others and thinking of the people that she loved. She was faithful in small things as well as in the big ones. And again, as we know, the good is always concrete. It was also the fact that, prayer, contemplation and action was like, as it were, a synthesis of her life. And it radiates the charism with which she was gifted. The corporal and spiritual works of mercy were always her immediate focus. At the same time, she understood that it's useless to preach the word of God to someone who is hungry. You must feed the person first. But then when she relieved someone's hunger, she never failed to help the person to turn to God, the giver of all that is good. And again, that's one of the things that came through for the theologians reading her life, that she was an excellent catechist. And we see that, I won't go into that now, but you see that in the cottage controversy. So what Catherine asked of herself and others was doing the ordinary everyday actions, starting from the most simple, doing them with attention and with love, and that was far more important than trying spectacular efforts that were abandoned at the first hurdle, as she'd say herself. It is through her very ordinariness that her strength of spirit and her holiness becomes visible. She appreciated the value of the ordinary, to bring a person into close contact with a merciful God whom she knew, and she always said, is much nearer than we are to ourselves. Now think about that. What would that mean to you? God is much nearer to you than you are to yourself. Catherine understood something of that. And it's through her letters that Catherine's ordinariness and gospel simplicity are revealed clearly and unequivocally. In one letter, and those of you who know me will realize why I'm saying this, Catherine, with great good humour, recounts the simple fact that they had to keep hot turf under the butter in order to be able to cut it. Because the weather was so cold in Birr in County Offaly in the winter of 1841. But her letters are full of anecdotes of ordinary, everyday happenings. There's nothing airy-fairy about Catherine. Concern for somebody who's sick, rejoicing with somebody's success, sharing tidbits of information and advice, commenting on someone's behaviour, delighting over a gift, or being devastated at the news of illness and death. What makes her letters so attractive and so readable is their unaffectedness and the warmth, friendliness, care for others, and interest in the detail of the other person's life that is evident in every line she wrote. And that is holiness. If, as John Henry Newman says, a person's life lives in his or her letters, or would we say in his or her emails, then Catherine's letters portray a life of simplicity, of warmth, of humour, of realism, of love of people, and an unswerving faith and trust in God. Would you like to stand up for a minute? You've been listening for 30 minutes. And you at home as well, would you like to stand up for a minute too? Just to stretch. Okay, we can begin again. Okay, so welcome back, everybody, and welcome back to the people at home. I hope you didn't stray too far away. That's holiness. Let's look at what is heroism when we come to talking about a holy person. We said Catherine was heroic and holy. There are three elements that qualify an action as heroic, according to the church in its making of saints. And these three things are actions, and you'll see this is the language of the church now, it's not my language. Actions performed at a level which is beyond what is normally expected of the good person. Actions beyond what is normally expected of the good person. And it was obvious in Catherine, again, if I repeat, the way she used all her inheritance for the poor. Or for those of you who would be my age and who would remember a religious life that is long since past, her acceptance of the necessity to become a religious sister at 52, back in the 1830s, in order that the poor might be better served, more surely served, even though this was a long, long way from what she had imagined for herself in her life. The practice of good, in order to be seen as heroic, must be continuous and progressive. Now, what do we mean by that? In Catherine's life, from the time she began to help the tenants on the Callahan estate in Coolock, through her teaching in St. Mary's in Middle Abbey Street, to her building of the House of Mercy in Bagot Street, through her founding of the Sisters of Mercy. In Catherine, we see a heroism that was continuous and was progressive in her life. And thirdly, what's looked for is that the behaviour becomes a powerful example and encouragement for those who are in direct or mediated contact with the servant of God. And again, in 1827, Catherine's first companions who came to help her with her works of mercy in the house here in Bagot Street were attracted by the way she lived, which one of them described as a prayerfully quiet way of being that attracted and that encouraged. Her light on a lampstand, Matthew 5:15, is no less attractive than it was back in 1827. When the church looks at the life of a person in order to discern really if the person's life was heroic and holy, what they look for is what the central virtue in the life of the person was. Now, by virtue is meant being the best you can be. That's what virtue is understood as. Being the best person you can be. And the virtue that they found in Catherine was the virtue of humility. When the life of the person who's being looked at is the virtues that they start looking at are the virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Then they look at how the person has lived prudence, justice, courage, and temperance. And then how the person lives the virtues of his or her state of life, which for Catherine would be those associated with poverty, chastity, and obedience. For a married person, it would be the virtues of the married state. And when they looked at Catherine and all these virtues, the theologians came through that the central virtue for Catherine McAuley was the virtue of humility. Catherine didn't talk an awful lot about humility. Where Catherine saw humility was in Mary of Nazareth. And she says, humility makes us close imitators of the Blessed Virgin, who at the time of her unequaled exaltation intoned the Magnificat, so expressive of her deep sense of God's goodness and her own littleness. From what we know of Catherine, she saw humility as necessary to serve people in need. We can't go around doing the grand lady if we're serving people in need. She herself was a humble woman, and those who knew it said it regularly. Her humility, it would seem, came from her awareness of her own need for and absolute dependence on God. From her letters and her writings, it was clear that she was convinced that she was God's instrument, a strand in the great tapestry of God's divine plan, only a strand, but a very necessary one. It was her grounded self-acceptance of who she was before God, nothing more and nothing less, that was the secret of her humble hospitality. There was room in her heart and in her house for all who needed hospitality, family, friend, or stranger. In opening her heart to God, she lived what the gospel asks: love one another as I have loved you. Catherine was very conscious of her own limitations, and this knowledge saved her from any messianic complex that can be the mark of people who do great things. A novice in Carlow, who met her a number of times, said about her, "There was in her an absence of a manner of telling, 'I am the foundress.'" She was cheerful and motherly withal. Her humility was also inherent in her theory and practice of leadership, as we see in the advice she gave to Elizabeth Moore in her letter of December 1838. You remember, don't let crosses vex and tease. meet all with peace and ease. So in this, Catherine lists the virtues she associates with humility, humble leadership, such as kindness, acceptance, gentleness, patience, prayer, and good example. Don't ask others to do what you won't do yourself. And when she was dying, she didn't name her successor. She could have done. She rarely drew attention to herself during her life, except when it was absolutely necessary, as we see when she was very ill. While in her health, she did ordinary things like serving at table, helping with the washing, looking after her own room, and never exempted herself from the ordinary work of the house. And I suppose, for example, her humility is epitomized at 52 years when she underwent the rigors of an intensive novitiate. In the time when it took place, this act of humble submission was in itself nothing short of heroic. It was rendered even more significant by the fact that at one stage of her time in George's Hill, where she did her novitiate, there was a question of the validity of her novitiate, which threatened to prolong her absence from Baggot Street. And we can only imagine the anguish at a time when she was extremely anxious about the people, the young women, remember, who were less than half her age and who were running the project here in Baggot Street. She was extraordinarily anxious about them. And you can imagine that that certainly moved her to leave George's Hill as quickly as she could on the day of her first profession. So her ability to surrender humbly to God will always shine as a lamp for those of us who follow her, especially as we get older, and surrender back to God all the capacities and abilities that we once took for granted, like sight, like hearing, like mobility. We won't be taking stairs 2 or 3 at a time as we usually do. In her relationships with others, and again they point this out, acceptance and acknowledgement of her own shortcomings allowed Catherine the ability to apologize with courtesy to others. And it gave her great peace, serenity, calmness, and gentleness. Because I would say she was a person who could get very anxious. If you read through the lines in her letters, especially with the chaplaincy, she was a woman who could get very anxious. But she learned to put that anxiety into God's hands. And that's no easy thing, again, as we'd all know, if you're really anxious about something. She'd say, "May God forgive me, make me humble, before he calls me into his presence." Given her humble trust in God, Catherine knew real joy in responding to her call. And it is real joy that gives us courage to go out in love, to go out beyond ourselves, out towards others and towards God. It is true joy that pain does not destroy, which first brings maturity. And that's something we saw in Catherine. She was somebody who was very joyous, even though she suffered quite a lot. And it is joy that stands the test of pain and is stronger than affliction. That joy is really authentic. And that's the joy we find in Catherine. Catherine opened her arms to welcome the mission in life entrusted to her. She lived it joyfully, knowing that through this she would bring others to God. And as it happened, as a side effect, she grew herself in wholeness and in holiness into being the loving, mercy-bearing person that she was. However, Catherine wasn't born a saint. She had her own faults and failings. And again, the theologians picked these out. Not big things. They weren't major mortal sins. They weren't big. But one of the ones was Mary Clare Moore. Do you remember she gave out to Mary Clare Moore and then promptly asked forgiveness on her knees? Remember that? Because Mary Clare Moore used to annoy Catherine. She said that like Mary Clare Moore would spend 3 weeks doing the petals of a flower in her illuminations, and then Catherine would say, and she called that work. So you can see, so she got so frustrated someday that she publicly gave out to her, but then she promptly asked forgiveness on her knees. Now, that's something that isn't easy to do. Not the easiest thing to go down on your knees and ask forgiveness. She admitted that she had difficulty with the pace at which Mary Clare worked. And obviously, this difficulty spilled over into a public rebuke at some time. She said, I do not mind half of what she says on these scientific points about illumination, which she delights in unfolding to those foolish people who will listen to her. She will do anything in the register you wish, but what is asked. And she calls this 3 weeks' work. But she could not give that time until the bazaar was over. She's very slow. That was Catherine. Catherine said that. It also seems that Catherine had difficulty understanding what we might call difficult temperaments that lacked gentility and refinement. She had to struggle with that, to love them as equally as the people that, seemed courteous and refined to her. Do you remember as well the chaplaincy? Do you remember the chaplaincy dispute? She read 3 sentences of an aggressive letter from Dr. Myler, who was the PP in Westland Road Church, before burning it. The chaplaincy really sent her into a state of great agitation. Again, read it closely and you'll see it. However, it is to her credit that she was on good terms with Dr. Myler at the end of her life. He was one of the people who came to see her on the day she died. And it's also to his credit as well, because they didn't see eye to eye at all about it. She also, and watch this one, because this is something that caused a little bit of controversy about Catherine. She made a throwaway comment about a Dr. Pusey, P-U-S-E-Y, right, Pusey, from Oxford as follows. This is what she said. In conversation, he does not express any imbecility except the wanderings of all Protestants. Now, again, remember the time, we'd be, so politically correct, we wouldn't be saying things like that. But that's what she said. And remember her difficulties with, the Protestant side of the family, that way, and what her difficulty, but that's what she said. So like all of us, she had her blind spots. For example, she warned Cecilia Marmion, the novice mistress, about having favourites among the novices. Through verse, she made a poem about it because she was inclined to say, treat things lightly. If you need to sort of say something to somebody, do it in a humorous way if you can. So she wrote verses to Cecilia Marmion and she told her, don't be having favourites among the novices. And when the novice mistress pretended she didn't understand what Catherine wrote, what Catherine was saying to her, Catherine said, I feel great indignation at the pretended difficulty in understanding my lovely expressive ballad. At the same time, Catherine herself was inclined to get attached to people she liked. Do you remember the bit about the Sister Margaret Dwyer? Do you remember? She said about this was a young woman that had joined. She was a postulant at the time. And she said, now this is again Catherine's words, I am almost infatuated with the darling, heavenly little Sister Margaret D. I never met in this great world a sweeter little dove, all animation, candour, and real good sense. I declared she should be Queen of the Order in general. This comment was taken up quite seriously by other members of the community. People reacted to it, and a strong opposition party was formed, headed by Sister Mary de Patsy. That's in manuscript 1A, number 162. So again, she's very, you can see the ordinary. She was a woman of her time, a woman of her day, affected by what went on in her life, what was going on around her. She seemed unable to overcome an innate diffidence, ambivalence that existed between the Irish and the English. Now remember the time, the 1820s. She was very excited about the English candidates when they came first. And then later from England she wrote, "We cannot avoid preferring our sweet Irish sisters everywhere." But can you see her ambivalence? It's just the ambivalence that we're saying. These simple examples, and they are simple, take nothing from Catherine. Instead, they show her humanity and that she had to handle herself in her relationships with others as everybody does. However, her closeness to God rendered her very sensitive to her failures, and she saw faults in herself that lesser mortals would never notice nor ask pardon for. Catherine's death. Catherine died a death that any Christian might hope and pray for, and which every Christian must admire. Without any fuss, without any fear, she gave herself back to God as she'd given herself to him in life. And we know that Catherine was scared of death. Do you remember her mother? She took care of her mother, and her mother had a very difficult death. And from that time on, Catherine had a great fear of death. And then, she lost so many people of her family, of the sisters, of people that she knew because of TB. Do you remember the TB was rampant in Ireland at the time? And yet, when she came to her own death, she had grown into a serenity, an acceptance, and a surrender. Now, that doesn't happen like that. And again, all of us know that we have to learn to handle the existential anxiety that is in every human person in the face of death. And we have to learn to handle that in order to surrender ourselves back to God. Vincent Whitty, who was present when Catherine died, said, "Yesterday," this was written on the 12th of November, so this is on the day Catherine died. "Yesterday, she said to me," and now listen again to the woman who says this, "If you give yourself entirely to God, all you have to serve him, every power of your mind and heart, you will have a consolation you will not know where it comes from." And then Vincent Whitty goes on to say, "Indeed, she looked the picture of entire abandonment of herself and all that belonged to her into the hands of God." And we know that Catherine came a journey from a powerful, gripping fear of death to that kind of surrender. It's the people who know the holy person who claim him or her to be God. It's the role of the church to discern that claim and search its authenticity. The church doesn't choose this person and say, "We're going to show you that this person is holy." No, it's the person who lives with the holy person. Do you remember when John Paul II died on the 5th of April, whatever it was, 2005? Do you remember the crowd in St. Peter's Square started shouting, "Santo subito," make him a saint immediately, right? That's the people, it's the people who say, and it's the very same with Catherine. It's the very same for any holy person. It's the people who live with them who say this was a truly human, a truly holy person. The same with Catherine. Those who knew her, not only her companions, the Sisters of Mercy, but also priests, bishops, the poor whom she served unstintingly, declared that she was a truly holy person. And contrary to her own estimate of herself, Catherine was known for her holiness at the time of her death. Father Miles Gaffney, the Dean of Maynooth, he said, "Few people left in the world in 1841 can with more confidence expect to hear the following words on the lips of our Redeemer. 'Come, you blessed of my Father, for I was thirsty. I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. I was a stranger and you took me in.'" You find that in the Bermondsey Annals. But he summarised very succinctly what was the core of Catherine's expression of mercy. The spiritual and corporal works of mercy. Catherine recognised very clearly from Scripture that we will have to answer more for omission than for actual sin when we come face to face with our Redeemer, because of our tendency to look the other way in face of our neighbour's need. Catherine's cause for beatification started in 1909, when Mother Genevieve from Carysfort sent a letter to all the different mercy foundations around the world asking that Catherine's cause be opened. Now, watch the date, 1909. Catherine died in 1841. 1909 was about 60-something years later. At that time, before the change of canon law in 1983, a person had to be dead 60 years before you could initiate the cause for beatification. With the change in the Code of Canon Law in 1983, that 60 years was changed to 5. The saying is that John Paul did it because he wanted to be able to canonize Mother Teresa of Calcutta. It also happened that he profited from it himself as well too. But however, the process is the same for everybody. So the cause started in 1909. Then it wasn't moved forward at that time because bishops said that the historic situation in Ireland was too tense and they didn't have time to devote to getting somebody to go after all that was necessary to gather all that was written by and about someone like Catherine McAuley. So it went into abeyance then, and again in 1923, an effort was made to start the cause again. And again, the political situation was just around the Civil War time in Ireland. Political situation was seen as not being suitable for it. It was tried again in 1937. And again, the world situation, things were very uneasy and they just hadn't time to be doing things. This wasn't seen as something necessary, do you know what I mean? So that's what happened. And then it was back in 1957 that the Historic Commission was established in the Diocese of Dublin, because the cause is always carried out in the diocese in which the person dies. And the Historic Commission was established, and all the documents, like what I mean by that is Catherine's letters, anything she wrote, like the retreat instructions, her notes, anything that she wrote, anything that was written about her in the annals, anything that was said about her, even things in newspapers and everything have to be all gathered in order that they can be scrutinised and put together in chronological form. And then in 1975, Angela Bolster took over as the vice postulator. Remember Angela? Yes. And she did Trojan work. She gathered the material, she put it together into a form that was acceptable, and the Positio was written. That's the Positio on the virtues was written, and a tome, a huge two big books. And then in April the 9th, 1990, Catherine was declared venerable by Pope John Paul II. You remember that? Okay. Since then, the next stage in canonization is beatification. And for beatification, the Church recognizes Catherine as heroic and holy. The next stage is beatification. And for beatification, at this point, what's needed is a miracle, right? And for a miracle to be recognized by the Church, it must be, as it were, it must happen, the healing, if it's healing, must happen in a space of time that is not normally needed for the illness itself. The healing must be complete. The person cannot die from it. It must happen while there's prayer going on to the servant of God, and it must be inexplicable to medical science today. The doctors must be able to say, well, there's something here that I cannot explain from a medical perspective. So over the period from 1990 up to today, we have been working on various, what we would call extraordinary favours or alleged miracles. And at the minute, I'm working on one. In fact, I'm going to Rome tomorrow to bring stuff on an alleged miracle that we have to get translated into Italian in order to put it together into a posizio, that is a book form, on the miracle, and then it'll be handed over to the consulta medica, because it is a healing, it's an alleged healing of a baby, a child that had very bad head trauma, but recovered extraordinarily quickly from it. So we're hoping and praying that maybe this is the one. We've already gone through a number of alleged healings. I mean, there's a number of them. We had different ones. Mostly they come from the east coast of North America, which is interesting. Most of the alleged miracles that I've dealt with in the last 13, 14 years have been from the east coast of North America. But I'll just give you an example of how it can happen. We would have had, for example, the alleged healing of a man who had prostate cancer, who got chemo for the cancer, got out of that, and the next thing is sometime later he got a lump on the 14th vertebrae of his spine. He didn't want to touch chemo again. Remember, this was a number of years ago. Didn't want to touch chemo again. He asked Sisters of Mercy to pray. They prayed. The lump disappeared. And we thought we had our miracle. So in order, all the materials are gathered, all the lab reports, all the doctor's reports, everything, all the medical history is gathered. It's put together, the story of the healing is written. Then that's shown to or brought to experts, medical experts. So we brought all this material to one of the head of the Consulta Medica in Italy. He went through all the material with a fine comb. I don't know what I'm doing. He went through all the material with a fine comb, and eventually what we heard was that actually the lump was caused by the chemo going through the system. And when the chemo had kind of gathered in that point, and then when it went through the system, the lump disappeared. So it wasn't a miracle. Okay? These are the these are the examples. We had another one of a young girl fell off the back of a golf cart. Very bad trauma to her head. Doctors said to the parents, if you have an operation, she'll either die or will be a vegetable. The mother had been to school with the Mercies. She said, I'm praying to Catherine McAuley. She did. The sisters were praying. All the associates were praying. The girl got better. She, got completely better. She went on with her studies. She's now married, has children. We gathered all the materials for that, and it takes a long time to gather all the medical notes and all the medical tests and results. And then what they found was that the healing was not complete. She had to have therapy or speech therapy in order to get back her speech, so that the healing wasn't complete. They're the sorts of things that happen. It looks like it's something like it. The process, and can I say it to you, the process is the same for everyone. The only movement, you need one miracle for beatification, one for canonization, right? But the church seems to be moving in the direction of, if you have one miracle for beatification, she doesn't always ask for the second miracle. For example, when Pope John Paul II was canonized, do you remember John the 23rd was canonized with him? Do you remember that? But John the 23rd did not have a second miracle. He was canonized. They used this word equipolente, meaning he still had fame for holiness after all those years, and the second miracle was not required. The same has happened for people like Hildegard of Bingen, Angela Foligno, Peter Faber. A number of them have all been canonized without the second miracle. But that's the situation as it is today. Would you like to stand up? Would you like to stand up at home as well for a minute? I really have gone out of time here. Yeah, I don't know if we have time for questions. One question, okay? Okay. Can we gather back in? Can we gather back in? Thank you. So, thank you. Just one last thing. We just have about 4 minutes. It's nearly 3:30. Just one last sentence, just to say to you that the cause for beatification, because it focuses on the charism, even though I've talked about the person, do you know what I mean? But the major focus is on the charism and how it's lived. It has a meaning that transcends the persona and the institute, and has implications for the whole of the church. Just to remember that, that's important for us. I think, have we time for one question? If anyone would like to ask me a question, I'm sure. Anything that strikes anybody, or a question about the cause that you've had in your mind for a while. Yes? Sorry? Yes, actually that's why I'm going to Rome in the morning, to bring the materials, to have them translated into Italian. We're still doing it, but it hasn't got as far as the Consulta Medica yet. But this time we're hopeful. This time we're very hopeful. It's been going on for quite a bit now. We don't know. I cannot tell you, but I'd be hoping. But until it passes the Consulta Medica, we cannot know.
Is it helpful if the diocese supports the miracle? I mean, does that add anything?
In fact, the diocese is very closely involved. It's the bishop of the diocese. Once the cause is started, say back in 1909, once Sister Genevieve asked that they'd start the cause, it's asked of the bishop. And it's the bishop who sets up the historic commission. It's the bishop who is behind. He gets, for example, say we come to witnesses for an alleged miracle. It's a diocesan tribunal that is set up to hear those witnesses. So it becomes the church's process, even though we do a lot of the work to carry it forward. But the diocese is very involved and would be involved the whole way.
Brenda, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I guess it is a little tiny bit frustrating that the rules for beatification and canonization were written in a totally different age than the age we live in. And if you just look at the numbers of hospitals and schools and women's refuges and centers for ecology that exist around the world and carry Catherine's name or the mercy name from Catherine's charism, you see the holiness, the people expressing in everyday actions the results of the holiness of this woman. I think we're being bound by rules that came from a time when the world was not global, And I hope there's a parallel, nothing to do with your work, but there's some parallel activity that recognizes the major shifts in time that still bring out the holiness of people like Catherine McAuley and Nan Onego and others.
Ah, yes, Elizabeth, I agree with you entirely. In fact, the miracle is you. Do you know what I mean? That in all of these years, do you know what I mean? All of the people down through the ages, and not alone the sisters in the congregation, but so many more. In fact, as you heard me say, 250,000 people of partners, collaborators, associates, and more. Do you know what I mean? That we don't even count. That's the miracle, without a doubt. And I mean, in God's plan, maybe that is our miracle. Eventually, we may say, however, once the process is started, we follow it, you know, and that's why I mentioned the point about equipolente. The church is changing. And the other point is medical science. Do you know what I mean? Now, not all miracles are medical, but most of them are. But medical science is getting more and more and more sophisticated. I mean, very soon it'll be very hard to know, right? And you can see that the church is only coming out now about that miracle in Knock. After 35 years, medical science still can't say why. So that's, yeah, it's true. Things are changing. And you know, what I would have found, and I'm sorry now, but what I would have found is it's the power of Catherine as you engage with her in your life. That's the strength, that's the power, the way she lived the charism and how it draws you into the charism. And I've seen so many people, and particularly, can I say, lay people, who have been absolutely taken by the charism. And that's what, when I said to you at the very end there, it goes far beyond Catherine's persona. People say to me, Catherine wouldn't want to be a saint. Do you know what I mean? She wouldn't. If she wanted it, we would not be talking about her here. So no, it's nothing to do with her persona. It's nothing to do with the institute. It's nothing to do with the congregation, except that we are the conduits for it, right? But it's the charism, it's that way of expressing the mercy of God in the world that's important. That's the thing that matters. Nothing else matters. And I bet you Catherine would say the same. That's what I would say. Angela, yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah, that's what I was saying, and that's Elizabeth's point as well. We and all the others, do you know what I mean? All the people that are touched by that charism. That's the miracle that continues. It's a living, pulsating, heart-beating miracle. It's not something that's enshrined in a statue or anything like that. Exactly. That's exactly it. Can we draw this to a close? Okay, Mary. Thank you very much, sisters. Thank you.
I think you have shown your appreciation for Brenda and what she has offered us this afternoon. As I listened to her, in one way it sounded extremely simple. Do the ordinary things extraordinarily well. And I think that's the message she leaves us with, that in one sense it's very simple. In another way, it's very demanding. And I know we would all like to see the word saint in front of Catherine's name, but at the end of the day, what really matters is that the influence of her life calls us to a commitment, and that the work of mercy, the mercy of God, continues from age to age through those of us who are privileged to be called to be conduits of that mercy to a world in need. And so I think that's what Brenda has left us with this evening, the challenge to be people of mercy, to be the miracle ourselves, to be that presence in our world. And so, Brenda, we thank you. And we have just a very small little token here. This is a lovely little booklet that has been prepared on the sacred garden that we're just, as you know, we're celebrating Jubilee by its opening or by its rededication. So we'd like you to be the first recipient of this, and it's very fitting, I think, that you are the first recipient of this lovely.
Thank you very much. There is a cup of tea upstairs if anyone would like it, and for those who are able, we will gather here at 7 p.m. tonight for evening prayer.